Open this public hearing of the Standing Committee on Procedures for its inquiry into certain recommendations of Set the Standard report. The hearing's being held, of course, with members of the House of Representatives from Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. This is the first of the committee's public hearings into recommendations 10 and 27 of the Set the Standard report, with further hearings planned. In accordance with the committee's resolution of the 8th of September 2022, this hearing has been broadcast on the Parliament's website, and proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be also published on the Parliament's website in due course. We welcome all those who are following the proceedings online. Please switch your mobile phones to silent. I'm just checking mine as we talk. Those present or listening to the procedures are reminded that filming and recording are permitted during the hearing. I also remind members of the media who may be listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. I now welcome three former Speakers of the House, with whom many of us are very familiar, and Ms Anna Burke, Mr Harry Jenkins and Your Honourable Peter Slipper, to give evidence today. And for the sake of informality, and so that we can, of course, deal with each other in a very interesting and I think helpful and educative and informative way, I'm going to refer to you by your first names because I know all three of you. Okay, so and we'll do that. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you this hearing is a legal proceedings of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as the proceedings of the House. Giving a false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It's unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated as contempt of the Parliament. It's also contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. These are public proceedings, although the committee may agree to a request to have evidence heard in camera, or may determine that certain evidence should be heard in camera. If you object to answering a question, you should state the grounds on which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine how to proceed. For the record, would each of you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? And for the sake of thing, we might go in chronological sequence, which would mean Mr. Jenkins, and then I think Mr. Slipper, and there's Ms. Burke after that. But I'll refer you to as Harry and Peter and Anna. Harry?
Thank you, Chair Shine.
And I'm sorry about the R after my name. For some reason or other, I've done it in honour of you, Harry, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. Harry Jenkins, citizen.
Peter?
Peter Slipper, also a citizen.
Anna?
Anna Burke, but I must declare as a current serving member of the AAT, I am here in my private capacity. I am making no comment on government policy, but in line with my work as a former Speaker of the House of Representatives, I have informed the Deputy President of my area I'm appearing today.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, and thank you for making that plain to everyone who might be listening as well. That's very important. As usual, and all three of you have been in loads of committees in your political careers. Would any of you like to make an opening statement? First to you, Harry, and then Peter, and then Anna, if you wish to make an opening statement.
Shane, very briefly, thank you for the opportunity to join with you. I wish you and your colleagues good luck in your deliberations. I think that this is a very important inquiry, but I also note it's in the context of other work that another committee is doing, and I think that inevitably there'll be crossover about their determinations with the way in which the standing orders should be framed. I think that in both cases there are reasonable things that you've been asked to consider. You can do it, simple or complex. I urge you to do just the simple. I think with the second of the areas, the time of sittings, there's been a lot of change over time with that. And I think that it's appropriate that those of you that are here in 2022 should look to the future and best decide the way that the sitting pattern goes forward. But I look forward to more full discussion later on.
Thank you, Harry. Peter?
Well, just picking up on that last point that Harry made, and it's good to see Harry and Anna again. When I was first elected to the Parliament, most of the members appeared to be my grandfather's age and not my father's age, whereas today there are many more younger members, male and female, with young families, and the changes in sitting hours that are being contemplated and ought to be contemplated really ought to recognise the current complexion of the House of Representatives. There are many more women there with children, and there are many more men there with children. And I believe that maybe the hours should be looked at. The hours of the day the sitting day should finish probably at 6 o'clock. We ought to be looking at avoiding as much as possible the Parliament sitting during school holidays. I think the question of women being allowed to bring young children into the chamber has probably largely been addressed, but that was very important. Also, in the past, there was some argument about whether we ought to have 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off, or 3 weeks on and 3 weeks off. With the 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off, with the 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, we sat 4 days a week. When I said 3 weeks on, 1 week off, I believe the Parliament used to sit for 3 days in each of those 3 weeks. It's really a question for the Parliament to decide which is the more family-friendly of those options. I think really what we ought to do is to make it as easy as possible for women and for men with children to A, carry out their parliamentary duties, and B, carry out their family responsibilities. As far as the general issue of this debate is concerned, I would like to commend the committee and commend the Parliament on this inquiry. My personal observation is that within the chamber itself, I've not observed a lot of sexist or otherwise exclusionary or discriminatory behaviour, but others might well have a different view. Outside the chamber, certainly that's occurred. But what we should be doing is recognising the fact that a lot of the responsibility for avoiding the issues which have brought about this inquiry is to recognise that the Speaker has ultimate authority in the House. Maybe the standing orders need to be strengthened to emphasise that sexist or otherwise exclusionary or discriminatory behaviour won't be tolerated. The sin bin maybe should be extended to give the Speaker the ability to sin bin people for 4 hours or maybe even a day. And that way, particularly with key legislation coming up with a finely balanced House, members would be more inclined to be better behaved, because at the moment people can be thrown out for an hour and they know that, well, there's nothing important coming up in an hour, so it doesn't matter. It would matter if we were looking at 4 hours or maybe even a day.
Thanks, Peter. We might hand over to you, Anna, and then I'm going to acknowledge country, and then I'm going to introduce all the other members of the committee so that you know who's talking to you. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Shane. I think I've met everybody but Anne, but I may have met Anne. If I have, my apologies, but I've certainly met Ross and Michelle, because Michelle's my local member, apart from anything else. So there we go. Thanks, Shane. And thank you very much for holding this inquiry. The Jenkins report, not our esteemed Harry Jenkins, but the other Jenkins, is a salutary reminder of what issues have come before and how they need to be addressed. The difficulty you have is that you are looking at the standing orders, which are very confined, but it's the public face of what the public see but there's very little wriggle room you have. You know, parliamentary standing orders, procedures, about the only word that ever we could throw someone out for or do was calling someone a liar. I mean, if you want to start listing the words that are sexist, misogynist, good luck to you guys. I wouldn't recommend it. I also have read all the submissions. Clarissa's is terrific, but I'm also not sure that you as parliamentarians want to start listing how members of parliament should behave. I think that is an appalling indictment on us if we, you know, and I count myself as a former parliamentarian, would need to be told how to behave. Having said that, so I just think you've got a difficult task ahead, but a really important one, because I'm not sure how you quantify it into those standing orders. When I got elected in 98, we were sitting till 11 p.m. at night. I had Madeline in 99. I came back to Parliament with a 3-week-old baby because nobody knew what to do. Everybody was like, what do you do? So it was myself and Jackie Kelly, who were really the first 2 females to actually have children whilst in Parliament. Ros Kelly had, but she lived in Canberra. So nobody ever really contemplated a member of Parliament with a child. We've come a long way. The sitting pattern is much better than it was. You know, Harry and I had some nights when I was Deputy Speaker and he was Speaker, and you're there all night. It's insanity. Leave aside the family friendly. You can't be making rational decisions at 4 o'clock in the morning. You're not making rational decisions at 4 o'clock in the morning. So there are things you can quantify and do. Also, I think it's really important when we look at the pattern, it's not just about the members, it's the staff, because they've got to be there before the day starts and they've got to be there after the day ends. So, you know, it used to be putting through a bit of ledge at the end, you know, 2 minutes to midnight. I'm sure you'll end up doing it, guys, before you rise for Christmas. Well, that's great. But then the poor, you know, procedures officers, the drafters are going to be up all night preparing the bill because it actually has to be on the table the next day for it to be a valid thing to vote on. So it's not just the confines of what you do, but how they impact the House. I think Keith Pitt's submission was really good because, okay, you can have friendly hours, but I wasn't going home to my family at night when I was in Canberra. I was going home to wave at them on Zoom, but they weren't there with me. You've got to look at the sitting time, the impact. Members of Parliament who have to go a long distance, you know, got elected with me. Michelle O'Byrne from Tassie, well, she couldn't get home on a Thursday night because there's no planes to Tassie. Kirsten Livermore couldn't get home to Capricornia. So I used to be able to get home to my babies. They couldn't get home to theirs. So the implications about everyone coming in and doing, it's not just, oh, we'll finish for the day. So what? Actually, in some respects, that's really bad because that's when everybody goes out and does things that we shouldn't talk about. You know, and, so it is a complicated thing. But everybody kept saying to me, oh, you know, this is happening and that's happening. It's a workplace. Yes, it is, but it's a very different workplace. And you've got to recognise that and make it, not exceptions for it, but look at it. There's some great studies out there. I would really recommend looking at what the IPU has done and doing one of the analysis that the IPU suggests, and this mightn't be for your committee, it might be in the other areas, but I think it'd really be good to do. Wouldn't be you doing it, it'd be an external body doing it. And they do a gender-sensitive check of Parliament, an ethnicity check of Parliament. Diversity is not just about women anymore. You know, diversity is about, you know, Parliament's meant to be for the people, of the people, by the people. You know, our Parliament still doesn't reflect our society. How do we get there? How do we make them inclusive? And how do we ensure we don't do anything to harm those people who are there and the people listening on? But good luck to you because I don't know what the answers are.
Well, thanks, Anna. For the record, I'm Shane Newman, the federal member for Blair and chair of this committee. And we do acknowledge, and I do acknowledge the Jagera, Yuggera and Ngarapul people, the traditional owners of the Ipswich region, which I'm talking from, and also the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in the Canberra area where the Secretary is based. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, we're going to go quickly around the committee. There's not a lot of people here today. Introduce ourselves. I'll come back, ask 1 or 2 questions, then I'll go to the Deputy Chair, Ross Vassar, to ask a few questions. Over to you, Ross, next. Ross, you're on mute at the moment, mate. You better unmute yourself.
A lot of people would like to mute him.
Go on, Ross. Unmute yourself. Not sure we can get him. We can't hear him, Ross. We might move on to Anne. Anne, you're right. You're on mute as well, by the way. What's going on here?
I think that might be the hosting area.
Are we okay? Is there a problem, Natalie, with the WebEx that Ross and Anne would have done through? Michelle, are you there? Can you speak?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we'll go to Michelle, okay? Obviously, and then Anne and then Ross. Michelle, introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Michelle Anandaraja. I'm a member for Higgins. It's a real honour to meet you all and to hear your testimony today. As you know, I'm new to politics and new to the Parliament, and it'll be the world you're describing is not a world I can relate to. So far my experience has been very positive, but I'm eager to hear how we can improve things.
Thanks, Ross. Ross, are you back now, mate? Are you unmuted? You're not. You're still muted. I don't know what the story is. Okay, Anne, can you write? And I mean, we might start anyway. I'll ask some questions because you can hear me. Look, I'm just wondering if you can recall any of you circumstances where the standing orders limited you in terms of how you responded to, say, poor or disrespectful behaviour in the chamber, and you felt, gee, and Peter might have alluded to it a minute ago, I would just like to do this. If I wish the standing orders were this. Any ideas, Harry or Peter or Anne? Harry?
No, I can't, not in specificities. I mean, in general, there would be a lot of things I would have liked to have done. But that was more in the general sense of my grumpiness. I was reflecting upon, outside of the standing orders, the sort of things that presiding officers have to resort to try to bring peace and functionality to the place. And sometimes that's speaking to the appropriate whip. And for instance, in one of your submissions, it suggested that the Speaker should have power to have removed a member that's intoxicated or under the influence. Now, that, of course, did happen during my speakership. And the way that we dealt with it is we would get onto the appropriate whip or onto some senior person that we knew might influence the member and just tell them, deal with them, get them out of the way, because it can't continue. So, there were different devices. I think the thing that Peter said, if you were confident that you had the full support, you probably would do things differently. Now, I mean, my confidence led to I got rolled on dismissing a member, and and not having a go at any individuals, but with people on the cross benches voting against the Speaker's decision, which sort of shocked me at the time, but that's the reality of politics. So if a Speaker really truly thinks that they will be given absolute support, there probably is more that can be done. But there's a step before. If you get into the standing orders, for instance, the suggestions in the Kate Jenkins report, to show leadership, to show that this is a line that you don't want crossed, then as you go forward, you'll work out what it all means.
Yeah.
Anna's right. Don't suggest a list of terms. back in the dim darks, that did happen, but it was a fallacy, because then they'd always be adding, or there'd be a debate. Well, it's not on the list. The other thing, Shane, I should have said, I recognise that I'm a white Australian male born in the 50s, and sometimes I've got to, take the deep breath to understand what is now happening in the wider Australian society in the year 2022 and beyond. And it's for people that absolutely understand that to teach old fogies like me to have a better understanding. And I simply say to Dr. Michelle, she mightn't have the background in Parliament and politics, but I reckon you're the expert on this committee, because we should be looking at it from a blank page, from your experience in the outside world, knowing what would be tolerated in the outside world, and then coming to this workplace and finding people don't care. And that was the thing that always amazed me, that here was a senior decision-making body that ignored the way in which society had moved on. And so the sort of terminology about expressions and behaviour, I think, should go in. There'll still be unparliamentary statements and things like that, but really put it down. And the other thing is that we rely a lot on precedents. I'm flattered that Speaker Jenkins the Younger has decisions that are still referred to this day, but that was 12 to 15 years ago. Your task is to put in place changes to your standing orders that are based on how you think they'll be interpreted in the future. So let's be left field. If there are things you don't think you can put in the standing orders, why don't you create guidance notes about what you really think should happen? They're used for a lot of similar types of regulatory frameworks, and it might be appropriate for the future that we not only base our behaviour on precedent and the standing orders, but future expectation. I've prattled on a bit.
Thank. I've just got one more question. I'll hand it over to Ross. We've got Dr. Karina Garland, a member for Chisholm, on the phone as well. But I just want to pick up one thing now that I think, Peter, you mentioned, and that was about the sanctions available. You suggested at times you might have thought, gee, not just hunt you out for an hour, maybe 4 hours, might have more of a sanguine or an attitude that you might take a step back and might not use that language or do that thing if you knew you were going to be punted out for, say, 4 hours. Can you explore that a bit, Peter? And then I'm just happy to ask Anna if she thought about that at some stage as well.
Well, I've never felt that the standing orders when I was Speaker stopped me doing what needed to be done. I suppose I had an advantage being an independent Speaker in the Westminster tradition, but what I used to do was to draw a line on the sand, and if anyone poked a toe over the line, then that person went out. Unfortunately, only for an hour. I believe that if we had a sin-binning capacity for, say, 4 hours, that would be a much greater sanction and people would be even better behaved, because I found to start with, people went out and then they went out the next day. And then all of a sudden they realised that it wasn't a smart thing to do. I remember I threw out one senior person who will remain unnamed from the opposition, and I called that person in, not that I had to explain why that person had been removed. But the response was, don't worry about that. Thank you for throwing Christopher Pyne out today because I got to lead the MPI. But the reality is, I found that if you draw a line in the sand and you're consistent and you're fair and you treat everyone from the Prime Minister to the most junior private member the same, then you do get better behaviour. But a longer sin bin period would inevitably encourage the whips to make sure that their members were better behaved, because if there was a key bill coming up to be voted on in a few hours' time, a member who was sin-binned for the period when that bill was coming before the chamber certainly wouldn't be very popular.
What do you think, Anna? And then I'll hand over to the Deputy Chair, Ross.
I think that one perspective from Harry, Peter and I's experience, we were there when it was a hung parliament. And so our impression of what you could do and not do was very much guided by that. So if I threw somebody out when I was Speaker at that stage, the government might have lost its majority, or if I threw somebody out from the opposition, then I would have disadvantaged them. So it also depends on the context with what you're dealing with. Certainly for me, the worst time in the chair was when I was doing the only Friday sitting we had, and I had no standing orders to fall back on and couldn't remember what to call a prop because I was so befuddled by the whole experience. You can Google it. It's on YouTube. It's still the worst day of my life. Yeah, thanks. I remember it too, and I blame Harry and the former ambassador to the US, who set me up right royally. But that was mortifying. And I didn't have any protection because we had said we wouldn't be having anything to do. So there was nowhere to go. And so the standing orders are really vitally important, and that people understand them and adhere to them. And that if you actually tell somebody that it is unparliamentary language and they are to withdraw, that they do withdraw. And that you don't end up in a debate about what it is that's unparliamentary. So a bit of what I'm going on is the respect of the chair. Now, a lot of that you've got to earn as the chair, and all of you sitting who've sat as also as deputy speakers know that. It's not just the speaker, it's the entire panel who does it. Obviously, the speaker gets the glare during question time. But, you know, I got challenged in the chair up in the Fed chamber. I was like, sorry. You know, so it is also the understanding about that role. And yes, the speaker can get it wrong. I got it wrong. You know, I got it spectacularly wrong on a couple of occasions. So you've got to have the ability to actually have that gravitas. I know that sounds ridiculous, but you really do. And people have got to respect it. And little things. I noticed the other day, poor Sharon got this yet again, Mr. Speaker, because you know, as opposed to madam. Why madam? I couldn't get everybody just to call me speaker. Speaker, yeah, that's the title. Why does it have to be gendered? I mean, there's just really silly things that we just do because we do. And you know, I wasn't having a go when I got there originally. You know, I remember when I was first deputy speaker and was in the chair at various points, it was like, oh, Mr. Deputy, the acting, rah, rah, rah. You know, I was like, guys, you can call me anything. Don't call me late for dinner. But no, it's actually important that people understand. And it's those little things that the public see, and it becomes that becomes the nightly grab as opposed to what's gone on during the day. And it's also, how do we elevate other parts of the parliament so it is not just question time, which is theatre, an important theatre, that is seen by the public. And so I know that's sort of a bit out of the remit, but why don't some of the fantastic speeches that are given up in the Fed chamber ever make it onto anybody's TV? You know, there's some fantastic things that people do for their electorates, they do for recognition for individuals. So there's other ways of actually elevating and also ensuring the parliament acts appropriately. But yeah, I think it's understanding and respecting the orders. How you do it is a good question, but yeah.
If I could,
Peter, and then we'll get
just come in briefly on one point. We ought to look at some of the things that as a parliament we've achieved. For example, the exercise of the Speaker's casting vote. It would be unthinkable now for any Speaker of either party or no party to exercise the casting vote in a way other than Harry has done, Anna's done, I've done, and I think Tony Smith has. I'm not sure whether Miss Bishop or Mr. Wallace had the opportunity of exercising the casting vote, but it is absolutely unthinkable that any speaker would do anything other than follow the rules that have been laid down.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Well,
Chair.
I've got to,
Sorry, Chair, just before
Harry.
just before the dulcet tones of Vasta, can I place on record a mea culpa about that infamous Friday?
Yeah.
I was back in the Speaker's office watching the Deputy Speaker being punished just because she was sitting in the chair, urged by my staff to go and save her. I was of the view that she had to learn on the job, and she had my support, but I was in the safety of my room.
Okay, thank you, Harry. I've got to tell you, in my observation of all three of you in the chair, and I've witnessed all three of you as speaker, I think you have handled it all with professionalism, diligence, and competency. So don't be too hard on any one of you individually. I'll hand it over to you, Ross, to Deputy Chair. Ross, you right? You can't hear it. Anne, over to you, Anne.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you all. So I'm Anne Stanley. I am the federal member for Werriwa, and it's a real privilege to listen to your insights today. So thank you so much for spending the time with us today. The thing that I'm struggling with, and I think the guidance notes was a fantastic idea, because the thing I struggle with is how do you tell adults how to behave? We're all elected by, my constituents expect me to behave in a particular way. And I don't really want to admit I have not been thrown out, and I've only been warned once. So I don't want to get myself thrown out of the parliament. I don't want to behave like that. But yeah, I'm struggling with how you frame a set of words that tells people to behave well. That's all. The other, I think Anna picked up on this. This is a unique workplace, and we also have to do a lot of work. But I agree with you, it is really difficult when staff have to start a couple of hours earlier and finish later, and then members of parliament get to speak for as long as they like and swan out the door. We need to find a better way of the procedures of moving bills between the House and that actual procedural work, I think, to allow it to go. I don't have any questions. I'm just sitting here listening in awe. So thank you all.
Anyone like to comment? Thanks, Anne. Anyone like to comment on Anne's? I raised a really good point. How do people are elected to Parliament, expected to behave. How do you provide that guidance from the chair and the sanction? How do you achieve that? And have you done that and guided someone from the chair? Don't say that. You need to, I think you'd be wise to withdraw. Over to you.
I mean, I've certainly tried to do that to people to save themselves. Probably more in the role as Deputy Speaker when people were just speaking at things and it might have even been intentional. And as like Harry said, that the terminology that people accept nowadays is different to what some people who are elected who'd been in Parliament a long time. But the only rule you have is the rule of relevance. Leave aside the unparliamentary language or reflecting on somebody. Parliamentary privilege is a wonderful thing, and I wouldn't say we'd ever get. But again, giving some guidance about how far that can go, because having sat on the Privileges Committee for a very long time in Parliament, there were certain things that were said under parliamentary privilege that were outrageous as well. So one of the things we don't do is educate members of Parliament about Parliament. What is the role? How does it work? Even there, I think the stuff the McKinley Institute's now doing with parliamentarians and people seeking to go on is great. because sometimes, you've got this great thing called parliamentary privilege, but, don't abuse it, but understand where the line is drawn, and maybe some guidance around that, some education, policy procedures. There is I don't know if anybody reads them, but, guides to procedures. There's actually a book. I dug it out. I mean, it actually exists. I know that sounds ridiculous, but sometimes you don't understand, it is an arcane institution. So having that understanding is not a bad thing.
Look, just picking up on what Anna's saying, I think one of the sad things is the fact that so many traditions of the Parliament, as far as behaviour is concerned, have evaporated. For instance, and one thing I did when I was Speaker, I was going to arrange for the clerk in a weekly bulletin to highlight some of the things that members ought not to do. For instance, how many members today know that he or she ought not to adversely mention another member of the House in the House without having first given that other member the opportunity of being present in the House? I remember I said something particularly unwise when I was first elected to Parliament, and Bill Hayden sent the Labor whip right around the House searching for me so that I could be in the House when he criticised me. And we walked into the House together, and he said, "Young fellow, I've got a big bucket to tip all over you." But he was so ethical, he insisted appropriately that I be there. And of course, most members simply wouldn't be aware that that rule ever existed. And so inevitably, if people don't know what the traditions are of that nature, like a tradition of courtesy, then people can't observe them.
Barry?
Yeah, there are a number of things that the obeisance to the chair as you enter the chamber. Now, everybody thinks, what's going on? And given that the tradition was that it was in St Stephen's Chapel in Westminster, and it was actually that it was a functioning church, that it wasn't actually to the speaker. But the point was that, as it was indicated to me, that if you make sure that people do that, they understand that they're coming into the chamber. It's that first step in reminding them that they're stepping into this special workplace. Whether it helps make the workplace functional over a dysfunctional workplace, I'm not sure, but it's at least a first step. The other thing I want to mention, Chair, was and it's been mentioned in one of your submissions, the fact that the debate goes through the chair is so important. Yeah. It's there to depersonalise the whole debate. And there was a bit of a flare-up a few weeks back, and I sat back and thought, well, hold it. If all those comments have been made through the chair, nobody could put their hand up and say, oh, it was directed at me, not the other person. And so people have got to tread carefully and make sure that they understand those things to diffuse the debate, or the heat in the debate, to make sure that if you're going to allow robust debate, that it's not personalised, it's about the issues. The strength and argy-bargy's not the problem if it's all about the contest of ideas. It's when it just gets so personalised. I might say that I observe the outside world of election campaigns, and that's not very helpful because that's all sort of at each other's throats. But once you get to Parliament, please, you've got to try to help the behaviour to be in that positive nature. And if I can just go back to Peter's comments about adding to the time that people can be put out. Even if you decided that if somebody gets 3 of those penalties in a session, that means that they're named. I mean, some people just see this as being a star on the chest. This sort of behaviour is seen to be rewarded. That these are people doing their job. Well, what job are we actually talking about if they're seen to be arcing up all the time to show that, this is a masculine place where you just rant and rave, and, the one that can shout the loudest is the person that wins the debate. Well, it's just wrong. So I think there's got to be a meaning where people just can't rattle up that penalty ad infinitum and, just be out for the hour and come back, at some later stage.
Shane,
Thanks, Harry. We might hand it over to Michelle, but before I do that, Ross has sent me a text message because he's got a problem with his microphone. So I'm now speaking on behalf of the Deputy Chair, and he says this.
he's in safe hands. He's in safe.
Microphone's not working. This is one of the few times we've ever seen Ross quiet, but anyway. Can we please thank all former speakers for their outstanding service to the Parliament on behalf of Ross? The recommendation of the previous committee, which Ross chaired, stated that there was a cascading penalty for repeat offenders, and this was a direct result of speaking to former speakers of the House of Representatives. What do you say about that? And secondly, and this is to Harry Jenkins, Harry, what's your view about the idea of scrapping question time?
Yeah. I'm sort of out on a limb on that
We
one.
might do it to Harry Jenkins' question first, and then go back to the idea.
Yeah.
And Peter alluded to it, Anna referred to it as well, the cascading penalty for repeat offenders. Go to first one, the question time.
All right. So as Anna said, there's so much that Parliament's put under the microscope during question time and then forgotten for the rest of the proceedings. And I just despair at that. There's no encouragement to people to in their thorough debate on legislation or issues to get credit for that. When I first was elected, there was when I was just before I was first elected, all those debates were covered in papers. And then I remember there was a journo from the Canberra Times that, used to give a cutout to backbenchers that had made comments and things like that. And, now none of that's done. To their credit, members of Parliament make sure by using social media that's achieved. So there perhaps it has to be a balance where we allow those opportunities and that they're done in an appropriate way, and then they can be put out by the member themselves. As for the, mine was an out there statement about getting rid of it. I just despaired that in the context that I don't think it can be improved until people, the collective decides we've had enough of it, and there are umpteen ways that have been suggested to do it. I've defended Dorothy Dix's, but if it takes getting rid of them, do that. Merely putting the same rules on answers as on questions, I think, a big step. But to the last point about the cascading penalties, come up with a version that you think's appropriate. I think it has to happen. You can't have 1 hour and a day, and the irony is that if you get named and thrown out a second time, it's 3 days. You up the ante there, but for the 1 hour, there's no upping the ante.
Over to you, Anna and Peter, and then we'll hand to Michelle and then Karina. Thanks, Ross.
Well, just referring to question time ought not to be abolished. Question time ought to be reformed. We ought to, in particular, look at the Canadian Parliament, where I think you've got 30-second answers. The UK Parliament, where you have a large number of supplementary questions. Question time is really an important time for the government to be held to account to the Parliament. And of course, by government, we don't mean members of the government party. We mean members of the ministry. And so it really is important that question time operates and that it operates properly. Dorothy Dix's should go. There should be short questions, short answers, large numbers of them, and a range of supplementary questions should be permitted. But returning to what the committee is examining, recommendations 10 and 27, the first one is ways to eliminate language, behaviour and practices in the chamber that are sexist or otherwise exclusionary or and discriminatory. I think that's largely up to the Speaker. I believe the standing orders are probably strong enough, but just to make it easier for the Speaker, maybe there could be a form of words put in that certain sorts of behaviour will not be tolerated, but really it is a matter for the Speaker, and the Speaker is ruling almost always, Harry, almost always be observed. The second one is ways to improve safety and respect in the chamber. Well, I think no one suggested to me that there was a lack of safety within the chamber itself, except when Wilson Puckey rushed through the door to vote one of the division, almost knocking over one of the attendants. Respect in the chamber, again, that's a matter for the Speaker. And I've referred to possible changes, and Anna's referred to possible changes in the way the Parliament sits. I still miss the way we sat, but the way Parliament sits with avoiding school holidays. I know we're a nation and we have different school holidays in different parts of the country, but they largely coincide. Sitting time should be family friendly. And we also ought to recognise that many more members these days, both female and male, have children and they have parental responsibilities.
Anna, and then we'll hand over to Michelle and then Karina after that.
No, I think the idea of a cascading penalty is a good idea. I mean, Wilson Tuckey, the famous, he used to try and get a 1 hour ping every Thursday sitting night so he could get the early plane home. You know, it became an absolute sport. And you sort of almost didn't give it to him, although it definitely needed, because you knew he was playing the game. But if you had something cascading, it would good. If you talk to your Senate colleagues, they'd love an hour ping because they don't even have that as a way of curtailing things in the House. Question time is vitally important. We've had some reforms, more needs to happen. Some of the stuff that's been adopted in our state jurisdiction should be looked at. Dorothy Dix's are important, but the idea of and any other comment, i.e. I now get to whack the government, I now get to whack the opposition, is just ridiculous. It's been vetoed in most of the state parliaments. I know it's not within your jurisdiction because that actually is the government of the day to move those sort of things, but it doesn't hurt for you to make some healthy recommendations about it that might be picked up on. Certainly the timing of the question, having shorter timing, shorter answers, less interjections. Again, standing orders can be changed to reflect that. Were all great things that came along. They've sort of slipped and slided, but, they should be there. Watch, the UK and the Canadian parliaments in action at their question time. Much better. But then again, watch other parliaments where they don't have question time, and Australia is actually the envy of the world because we actually do get to hold the government of the day to account. So, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater is the other thing you've also got to realise.
We might hand it over to your MP, Anna. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you. A fascinating discussion. I really like the idea of reforming question time. I think that what my observation sitting in the chamber is the noise level is sometimes just, it's unworkable. Even the speaker can't hear. And we waste a lot of time trying to bring the House to order. That's taxpayer time and valuable time. We're all working, the whole country's working, and it's just being wasted on theatrics and poor behaviour, right? I think shortening the answers, the responses, is a worthwhile thing that we should look at, Chair, because what I find also is that the longer the response goes, you get a lot of grandstanding, and then it tends to kick off this spiral of noise and retaliatory behavior, and the whole thing can de-escalate. And it's at that point, that peak, that we start to transgress. And there may be sexist comment or a misogynistic behavior, or something is misconstrued. And that's really what I've been observing, that there's this kind of cascade to a peak, and then something goes wrong, and then, the whole thing comes crashing down again. I understand. I'm just curious to know from all the previous speakers, it is a theatre, right? Politics is not a tea party, it is a theatre. So how do we retain that flair and that aspect of it, but still maintaining the fact that it is a workplace and we have to get things done?
Yeah, sorry, Michelle, you're right, because you're all there and you're passionate people, otherwise you wouldn't be there. You'd still be a doctor in a hospital. You know what I mean? People don't go into Parliament just, for pout. They don't, you all know that. So, be there. And for me, and over the years, it was taking out the vective. It was the personal as opposed to the issue. And hey, if you can address that with good standing orders, good adherence to standing orders, the chair having some gravitas, and curtailing that hoopla, and it just becomes, the playing to your audience, which 9 times out of 10 is the people who already were going to vote for you, i.e. all the members of, the government or all the members of the opposition, just becomes pointless. So for me, the passion is important. Just see how you can, by structuring the organisation and leadership from, all the people who are up there, that it's not personal. It's about the actual issues. I don't know how you achieve it, but that's, for me, has always been the thing.
Barry?
Sometimes, it's appalling theatre, bad theatre. But if it was theatre that had a purpose that was not directed at those that sit in a gallery behind the speaker, or to those that sit beside the person that's doing the acting, and that it's actually theatre that's pitched towards the people of Australia, that would help. And you could still have robustness, you could still have passion, but it's to get the collective mindset. And speakers can do a hell of a lot off their own volition, but they really need the support of everybody else. They need the goodwill of everybody else as well. Because you can have a speaker that gets on top of it, and then the next speaker, because they don't have the gravitas or whatever, it reverts, and that would be a problem.
Peter, you and I have known each other for decades. I think till the early 80s we first met, when I was a very junior lawyer in Ipswich. But you've had a lot of experience in another theatre, that is practicing as a lawyer, as a solicitor, and as a barrister. Another theatre. Can you pick up that point that Michelle talked about, the noise, the theatre of the chamber, and how that contrasts with your experience in other areas such as law? Because I found, certainly, when I got elected, used to a judge interrupting you all the time, but just a cacophony of noise, which you can't help but, as an initial member, feel a little intimidated by, because it's voluminous, to the point where the speaker, as Harry said, can't often hear.
Well,
Michelle.
Well, in my current occupation as a barrister, all of the colour, light, flair of the Parliament would be completely disastrous, because it would turn off the judicial officer, and in the AAT, Anna, I'm sure it would turn off the member. So a lot of what really would make a successful member of Parliament would be entirely contrary in the court system. You're either trying to convince a jury or trying not to get a judge or magistrate offside. But returning to the Parliament, I believe it is possible to have colour, light, air and flair, and for someone to shine, but it is important that the standing orders be applied fairly, firmly, consistently, constantly, and that every member be treated exactly the same. And once everyone knows it's a level playing field, if they step over the line, out they go. And I support the idea of cascading penalties as well. But the thing is that if you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have a Parliament that is theatre, as long as the theatre plays within the rules. And if the rules are breached, then the person who breaches the rules goes out, and that adds to the theatre.
Thanks very much. Any other questions, Michelle? Karina? Can you hear
Thanks
me?
so much. Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello?
Karina, Dr. Karina
Excellent.
Garland, the member for Chisholm.
That's right. Thank you. And thank you so much to the three speakers for today. It's a real privilege to hear your insights. Look, my questions kind of go to perhaps outside necessarily what happened in the chamber, but are still impacted, I think, by the standing orders, which are, obviously outside of the work in the chamber, there is other work of Parliament, such as committee work, of course.
Yeah.
And so just thinking through how that other necessary work is impacted by standing orders and how that balance can be struck so that all kinds of work we do in the Parliament are as effective as possible. And second to that, I've raised this before in other briefings that I'm concerned about, the impact on staff. All kinds of staff in the Parliament, the car drivers, the cleaners, of course, the staff of MPs, and what we can do around, for instance, things like certainty of hours. Obviously, we set out sitting times in the standing orders, but we have that, situation at the moment, for instance, where, after 6:30, we don't call quorums or divisions, but we're still kind of there between the beginning of adjournment and the business of the day. So just eager to hear your reflections there and what you think would be a good approach to try and balancing out all of these different considerations.
Chair, Karina makes a good point about the considerations of others outside of the members about the hours, and I think that that was mentioned by the clerk in her submission. I think it's a very important point. The committees, I'll put on the record again, committees are going to be the saviour of modern Parliament. I mean, that's where the real work's done, and that should be the thing that's highlighted. You don't have members of the executive on the committee, so it's real parliamentary work. And the same rules apply. And I was looking through the Kate Jenkins report, and there was a mention about somebody had said something about what a chair had done. And I thought, well, what we should make sure is that we sit down with the chairs and make them understand that if they've had no experience in the chair or deputy chair of the chamber, that the same standing orders apply, and give them help in sort of understanding that. And that will ensure that members treat each other with the respect that's required, and in fact that they treat the public with the respect that's required, because that is the interface of Parliament and the public. And Chair, quickly then allow my colleagues to mention on the hours, step back and look at all the options open. When I was first elected, we sat from Tuesday to Friday, and then Monday to Thursday of the next week. This meant that we had this crazy rush to the airport for Victorians to get back on the Friday late afternoon. Other people from far-flungs were expected just to stay in the nation's capital. Airline schedules have improved, but they haven't improved that greatly. But on the hours of sitting, we might have to step back and ask members of Parliament, what are their expectations of their work? So the sittings are all about going into the chamber, doing legislation. They're dictated by the government of the day. This is not something that, necessarily the Parliament ever gets to be asked about. So this is a great opportunity. Dr. Palmieri has suggested a questionnaire. I'm usually against questionnaires, but include those that are part of the affected, the members. Maybe even ask parliamentary staff what they think can be done. But we need to ask members, what do they actually think their job was? I got flummoxed one day when a whip said to me, members don't want to be here. They only want to be back in their electorate so that they get re-elected. Now, all right, I had a different view because I was a safe seat member, but I thought, is that all they expect of their job? To be like the American Congress, just worried about being re-elected and not actually doing something. But because I suspect that, you know, people get elected to do things, and how they do it will dictate the amount of time they want to devote in Canberra, the amount of time they want to devote to their committee duties, and the amount of time they want to devote to their electorate. So, you know, perhaps it's time just to sort of ask, well, what is it that's required? Again, you know, maybe it's a safe seat view. I thought that there should be actually more sitting days, but reasonable sitting days. But, you know, I take the point that you have to look at that family work balance. It's now just something that in the real world is expected. And the Parliament's actually in the real world. It's strange about that, but, you know, we've got to give that consideration.
I actually agree with what Harry said as far as the set, everything he mentioned is concerned. I mean, when I was elected also, the Parliament sat until 11 o'clock at night, and life is all about competing responsibilities as a parliamentarian. You're either doing the right thing by your electorate, the right thing by your family, the right thing by the party, and often when you do the right thing by one of those, you're doing the wrong thing by the others. I mean, let's look back. Things always change. Before the times of airlines, I'm told that parliamentarians from places like Queensland used to go to Canberra and stay there for the sittings. There was one member from Western New South Wales, Darling, and Canberra in those days was a fairly dusty place, and they had some windstorms around Canberra, and someone said to this member, "Hey, Jack, quickly come to the window," because there was this dust storm billowing around Parliament House, and Jack arrived at the door, and the person and he asked why, and someone said, "Oh, here's your electorate come to visit you." But seriously, everything changes. It is important to take into account the staff, and I think the point that was made earlier about when the House gets up, the staff at Parliament House continue to work so that the Parliament's able to operate the next day is something that ought not to be overlooked. I want to commend the government and you, Mr. Chairman, for this inquiry. I think it's a very positive way of improving the Parliament, and also the previous government with Ross Vasta as the chairman also was trying to improve the Parliament. I think there seems to be a multi-partisan view of the need to improve the Parliament, and inquiries like this are very positive. One last point I'd make to Harry, though, is Harry said as a safe seat member after the last election, what's a safe seat?
Over to you, Anna, and then we might finish up very soon.
Hi, Karina. I thought you were going to do a tricky one on gender politics. We really didn't go there because it's a difficult one, but hopefully you'll get to have Sonia Palermo come and address the committee, and it would be very valuable to have a discussion with Sonia. She used to, obviously, some of you won't know, but she was in the Parliament for a very long time before she went off into academia, has been at the UN and is very connected with a lot of people. So it'd be really worthwhile having a chat to Sonia and getting some of her views and you know, thinking about conducting, you know, the committee conducting a survey of staff and members about their attitudes. You know, we don't do it enough. We don't actually interact like it is a business. I mean, it's not, you know what I mean? It still is a workplace. Workplaces do these sort of things. Why not do a temperature test of what's going down amongst parliamentarians and staff? But Karina's point about how people are treated outside of just Parliament, which at least the cameras are on, I was involved in some committee meetings that were appalling, the behaviour of members in committee. And it was left up to the Secretariat, i.e. the staff of the Parliament, to try and intervene between some very nasty things, and that's highly inappropriate. So again, that people's understanding that the standing orders apply when you're in committees as well, that behaviour is expected in those places, and to try and step back from politicising committees. It's good to see that lots of committees don't get politicised, but some do. And it just becomes unworkable, as opposed to being the bastion of Parliament where, you know, bipartisan work happens. So really reinforcing that, I think, is important. But again, just going back to some education. But I think looking at what is happening with codes of conduct and how you treat staff, which isn't part of what you're doing, but is a vitally important connection into, you know, how staff are treated, you know, and it's the huge power imbalance.
Yep.
You know, even as you know, a little backbencher with your 4 staff, you appointed those 4 staff. You know, they knew, you know, what could happen if they didn't do all things, and you know, hopefully people aren't asking them to do inappropriate things like excessive hours or all the rest of it, but people are. What, you know, again, what are the structures? What are the rules? What are the expectations there? And again, the Jenkins report goes into some good stuff that needs to be adopted about, you know, how the staff are employed, because it's really weird, as we all know, weird and difficult, you know, that, you know, how that you appoint them, but you don't employ them, but you're the ones who can sack them. And all of us, and you'll all experience this if you haven't already, make some bad appointments with staff, and you've got to deal with it so long as you're dealing with it appropriately. You know, I had to sack somebody, and from a trade union background, that was never an easy or pleasant thing to do. But, you know, they were treating other staff members inappropriately, and there was a whole lot of stuff going down. You had to deal with it. But working out how I did that in conjunction with the Department of Finance was a nightmare. So having some good guidance around that for members, again, procedures, policies, processes, other places have got them, other public sectors have got them. Why don't we have them so members of Parliament can have access to those? A lot of people end up in Parliament who've never managed staff before, and now they've got to manage at least 4 staff minimum. You know, you may have to manage others. So I think there's a whole lot of things in there. But again, the hours you set and the impact on the greater Parliament. When Parliament's sitting, there's anywhere up to 6,000 to 8,000 people in that building. Think about the numbers of people you're actually impacting upon by the work you do, which at the end of the day is vitally important.
And just picking up on what Anna said, the employment of the correct and right staff, good staff, is very, very important. And I, for one, have made some unfortunate appointments.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Look, any other members have got any questions now? Look, once again, I want to thank you for your magnificent service, all 3 of you. I had the privilege of sitting in the chamber when all 3 of you handled difficult situations with real courage and honesty and professionalism, and I want to thank you for what you've done. The evidence today has been insightful. It's been very informative and very sage. So thank you very much, all of you, for taking the time to continue your public service in another way by giving evidence to us today. A copy of the transcript, of course, of your evidence will be available, and an opportunity for you to request any corrections of fact and transcription errors. I just want to close the public hearing and just thank you very much and wish you well in whatever you're doing.
Thank you
Thanks very much.
Thank you.